if you have div space table, what would that mean?
I'm glad you asked, because that's what we're going to talk about next. So you've been introduced to these selectors. Oh, and I missed one. I need to show you another one. This is great. But then we're going to get into combinators, and that's going to answer your question. So let's select the paragraphs on this page. Sure. You can see that we've got two of them. It highlighted lorem ipsum at the beginning. That's just like a short paragraph. And then it highlighted this longer paragraph. Now, what if I wanted to highlight just the first letter of that paragraph? You can do that with what's called a pseudo element. There are also pseudo classes, and I'll explain the difference. A pseudo element has 2 colons, and then the most common pseudo elements are first letter and first line. Now notice that the L in the lorem ipsum paragraph is red. So it's actually, even though there's not markup differentiating that first letter of my paragraph, it's been able to bring to the front this pseudo element. It's been able to apply a style just to that first letter. There's also first line, and this one's really cool because if you can see that it already has applied that to the first line. But what if I'm not doing color red? What if I'm, well, in addition to color red, I'm also doing the font size? Let's up that font size to say 24 points. Oh, let's try it this way. Oh, it's not liking that. That's right. The way it actually works is even if you're upping the font size and so not as much text fits on that line, it's still going to recognize what is the first line. So that's pretty amazing thinking about the algorithm behind that implementation. Now, there are a number of pseudo classes, and pseudo classes are like virtual adjectives. So whereas first line and first letter are like virtual elements, you could use hover as a pseudo class to indicate the state where the element that's targeted by this selector rule is being hovered over. So now nothing is red, but if I hover over this paragraph, it turns red. I can hover over the other elements here, and they don't, unless it's a paragraph. So the first one turns red, and the last one turns red. Now, how would I make it so that anything I hover over turns red?
I would think you'd just get rid of that paragraph.
Absolutely. I could either get rid of it, or I could put a star in front of it. Now, everything on the page has that hover selector. So notice even the biggest wrapper gets it. So my whole thing is, I'm still running into this scoping problem. My CSS is applying to too much, which brings me to the topic of combinators. Now, combinators are ways of combining simple selectors in your CSS so that they apply to really targeted sections. So for instance, right now, I'm applying to all elements that are of the hover class, all elements that are being hovered over, and it's affecting everything. It's not what I want. Now, I've rendered in this selectors example this #render behind here so that you can see that that's the ID of that render screen. So let me just prefix this with render and then a space. Let me try that again. Render. Actually, let me use the div1 that I have. So there's color red. So now I'm affecting everything inside of div1. But if I want to affect only the divs that are inside of div1, then I combine it like this. Now there's actually a character there. It looks invisible, but there is a character there. It's a space. The space is a first-class citizen in CSS combinators. It means the descendant. So div is a descendant of an element with an ID of div1. Let's look for those. Here's one. This div is a descendant, actually it's a direct descendant, of this div that has an ID of div1. Now, let's look for paragraphs that are the descendant of div1. So let's change that to a P. Notice that there's a difference between this paragraph and this one. See, this one is buried. It's a second-level descendant. It's a grandchild of the element with an ID of div1. And yet, the color red is still applying to that one. So when you use the space, that means any descendant, however deep in that structure. So it's a really great way of scoping, because if I know that my page has a certain class on it, then I can refer to that class in my CSS selector chain, and then a space, and then I know that all of the tags in there, all of the selectors are going to apply only within that page. So it's a great way of scoping. Now, the next combinator that I want to show you is similar to the descendant, but more specific. It looks like a greater than sign, an angle brace. Now the greater than sign says it needs to be a direct descendant. It has to be a child. It can't be a distant descendant, like a grandchild or a great-grandchild. So let's go back to our div1 and then div, this time using the child combinator. Now you can see that actually, no, I want that paragraph tag because we have an example of a paragraph tag that is a direct child, and we have a paragraph tag that is buried inside of another element. And this paragraph is not getting that style applied. It's too deep. It's a descendant, but it's not a child.
So when you're saying direct, what you're saying is it's an immediate child of that element. It's nothing that would be navigated through the hierarchy all the way down. So direct really means immediate child.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sometimes you have to be really careful and make sure that you're using an angle brace, because if you use a space when you meant to use an angle brace, then you're containing something like a div or a table, and later on it's going to itself have divs or tables inside of it.
Right.
You have to know that you're going to be affecting those if you use a space, but you won't be affecting them if you use an angle brace. So very important differentiation there.
Good.
Now there are two more combinators. They are the general sibling, that's the tilde, or the squiggly, as we like to affectionately call it. The squiggly means that there is a sibling relationship between these two entities, and it is sequential, but it doesn't have to be an immediate sibling. It doesn't have to be the next or previous sibling. Okay? Let's look, for instance, at ul and div. So if I say I have something that is a ul that is succeeded as a sibling, on a sibling relationship, by a div, I want to apply the color red to it. You'll notice that all three of these divs got that because they are, in fact, related to a ul that precedes them. The order is important. There is a ul that precedes them at some point, and so this style is going to affect this last element in my selector chain.
So if there was a div sibling before the ul,
let's give that a shot.
Sure.
In this selectors example, we can actually type some HTML. So let's put a div here, just say hi. And there's hi, and it has not been affected because the order matters.
Okay.
Now, what if I want it to be, just like we had descendant and then child, what if I want it to be not just a sibling, but I want it to be the immediate sibling or the adjacent sibling? Then, instead of a tilde, I use a plus. That means that it has to be directly next to it. So you'll notice that our divs here no longer get that style because they are not immediately succeeding a ul.
Right.
Now, if I applied it to a table, there is a table that immediately succeeds a ul as a sibling.
So must follow it and be directly adjacent to it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. You can use this as a trick to when you're looking at a list and you want to, for instance, let's look at all of the LIs that are immediately succeeded. Oops. Let's look at all of the LIs that are immediately succeeded by another LI. You'll notice that only the first LI did not get that. So if you want to apply something to all elements in a list except for the first one, that's one way you could do it.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. Now, there are some pseudo classes that I neglected to mention, so I want to back up here and I want to introduce those. Now that we have some concept of chaining, I want to tell you about some of these pseudo classes that would make it easier to do what I just showed you.
Okay.
One of those pseudo classes is first child. So let's look at all LIs that are the first child.
And what's at the end of that line?
That's a mistake.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and actually that's not applying yet because of a space at the beginning. That gets me every time. So I'm looking for the LI in a list that is the first child, and it only found one LI that is a first child. Now, there isn't an equivalent second child, third child, fourth child, but there is an nth child, and that looks like this. Nth child, now you have to specify somehow which child you're looking for.
Yeah.
And some of our selectors actually act like functions, and we can throw something in there into the parentheses. So in this case, I can say 1 to get the first one, 2 to get the second one, or 3 to get the third one.
So not a zero-based array.
No, not a zero-based array. Nope. It's actually following a pattern, an plus b. What it does is it takes the series of integers and plugs them in for n and does the math. And you can put in a pattern here. So you could, for instance, do something like 2n plus 3. and it's actually going to plug 0 in for n, multiply that by 2, and get 0, add 3, and determine that 3 or anything greater is going to be applied. So you get an opportunity to kind of specify a formula there and have that take effect.
Cool.
Yeah. Now, the child one affects all children of this LI. Not all children of the LI, but all LIs, which are the nth child. But if you want to make sure that it is of this type, then instead of nth child, you use nth of type. But these pseudo classes come in extremely handy. So go research all of the pseudo classes and make sure you know what they are, because otherwise you might try to use some JavaScript or use some other methods that just make it far more difficult. If you can find the right pseudo class, it just makes your code really elegant.
That's awesome.
Remember that as we're talking about this, you can drop into the Q&A session online and ask some questions, and we've got some people dedicated to answering those. So if you have questions about the pseudo classes that I've showed, any of the selectors or combinators that I've shown, or if you want to ask about some that I haven't shown, feel free to do that.
So welcome back from the break. We just finished off with some CSS stuff, and now we want to get really specific about this next topic, which is going to really be focusing on how we can control where things go on our pages or our screens. And specifically, we're going to be looking at layout options as well as animations. And that's really the theme of this particular module. And in both of those, there's little side points. You know, there's going to be layouts in terms of variations of what can be done with content. And with animations, we're going to talk about various ways that can be done, whether it's in a transition or whether it's truly just, let's just make something fly across the screen or do something crazy. So got a lot of jam-packed stuff on this one, kind of some eye candy. So we're looking forward to showing it to you. So
this is definitely a new world of web development with animations and transitions and
absolutely. Yeah, so even for those that are just purely web folks, this is also pretty exciting content if they haven't been doing it so already. So let's go ahead and consider now on our agenda where we're at. We're focusing on that advanced layout and animation, and we're specifically in here going to talk first. We decided to use the term legacy layouts because this was our way of saying we'd first like to introduce you to layouts that would still pretty much be universally acceptable or what would be done in a web browser. So
these still work?
Yeah, still works in the app land. So it's not like legacy means deprecated by any means.
Right.
We just use that word to say, here's kind of what maybe traditional could have been another word, you know. So we don't want to confuse anyone by the term legacy. It just simply means that we're going to look at some ways that have been traditionally the ways that we have done some layouts. And so let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So the first thing to address is going to be positioning itself and actually using that within CSS. You mentioned in the previous module the display, but it can also be used to help out with some layout things in addition to some of the things that you had mentioned. Floating allows us to take content and actually kind of zoom it to one edge or the other of whatever container it's in. And that z-index is used for when we're going to start putting multiple things in kind of the same area and which one should be foremost in front and which one's going to be in the far background. And that can be helpful, especially when we're using what's called absolute positioning. So let's take a look at a little code sample right here on positioning. The very first item here is referencing the ID of an element. So we learned that in the last module where it says, okay, if we see that hash line, then that means we're going to be identifying something. So whether it's a div or whatever the case is, we know it has an ID of ID01. Then we're specifying that it's absolute in position. A traditional way that when we don't supply any kind of positioning whatsoever, what the default behavior is going to be is however we're putting that markup on the page itself, it's just going to flow in that natural direction. So when we start to say, well, we're going to position it differently than that, such as an absolute, that's when these other properties start to make a lot more sense, such as top and left. You know, top means from the top